Recording in progress.
In the references that you've got, they don't actually give you the tools. So I've given you templates that have worked for me over a long period of time to pick them up. So pretty important to do that rather than just cutting through. And every presentation has a whole list of references at the back of it. And what I can tell you is a lot of them look the same. All right, they just dress it up as looking as though it's a little bit different, but the reality is that they're not that different to do that. Just want to echo something that Steve said about caring for each other. I'm conscious that some people in the room, like me, may have lived the experience of a response or even getting ready for it. And so over this week, what we cover off might trigger some responses. I know it will in me. So when I was looking at some of Joe's images, I could feel the welling up because I've lived that experience. And it won't always be from the response. So it can be in the preparedness phase or the risk mitigation, basically where you're working with people and your values or their values and, if you like, their morals may not align with yours, and over time that can have an impact on you. So just encouraging, like was said earlier, keep an eye out for everyone else, look after them, and if you see me take a little pause, that's probably because I'm just trying to get ready to say what I'm saying rather than thinking about what might be going to happen. All right, so quite upfront about the fact that I do carry scars and baggage from the decades of dealing with disaster in front of you. So pretty full on. And the other thing I want to do is, like most things, I might have written a lot of words for this, but there was a disaster management committee from OVAG, and Siska, I don't know how many Zoom meetings I've had with her, swapping and getting to understand terminology that, again, we take for granted in English, but there was no equivalent in Indonesian or another language. So this is very much a shared experience. And just these images they're all actually from Indonesia somewhere, and they'll be the basis of you doing some work on Wednesday, so you'll see the same sort of images as we go through. Do I just push the arrow to make it go? Or is this push the arrow and say next slide? There we go. I've been around long enough in this space to see it change. So way back when I started, the focus was on response. Basically run out, save the day, and go back home and go, yep, job done. And then over time, we started to talk about things like contingency plans, all right? And then preparedness came along kind of 15 years ago. But since particularly 2015, disaster risk reduction has been a push. And the key thing was globally in 2015, the Sendai conference, and that's a place in Japan, more than 180 countries agreed to this framework, all right, around disaster risk reduction. Now, it doesn't mean that preparedness is not there. In fact, it's one of the 4 key themes of disaster risk reduction. But as you'll see, if you only do preparedness, you're only going to deal with a response, and that in itself won't address the risks. All right, so it's all about reducing the risk. So all that terminology on there and a lot more is often evolved. So when I started out, didn't exist, and it's all there now. So and much more. And I've got to say, when I started to put this together, it was more about what I was going to leave out rather than what I was going to put in. So Steve talked about shared situational awareness, and in my other world, when I used to do training on that, that was a whole day. All right, so we're not going to get into a lot of detail. Next slide. So, and this is the framework, and it's got the headings on it. So you'll see the first one's about understanding the risk, and that kind of might seem obvious, but if you don't go to the trouble of identifying the risks, and that's what you're going to do on Wednesday, what they are for real. The second one is governance, and the UN made it really clear that every country and all the way down to individual communities, governance had to be fit and proper for the communities that it was dealing with. All right, and we'll talk about that a little bit more this afternoon going through. The other aspect is this, interestingly, Steve and I have taken a while to use the word resilience. All right, so disasters, moving a community that can cope, means resilience not only in the people, but the built assets or the infrastructure, all right, whole range of infrastructure, the economies, all right, and then the natural environment. And you can see them in the bottom in that statement taken from the UN statement. All four of those occur, and you'll see them themes as we go through. So when you're looking to reduce your risk, it's across those four environments: the social environment, the built environment, the natural environment, and the economic environment. And economic might seem subtle, but if you don't get the economic environment right, you're not going to recover, you're not going to be better next time around. All right, really important. Next slide. Should I push it? No, I pushed it. No, go back. You don't have to if you don't want to. So you can stay on that slide. The slide before it was just going to be the headings or the contents you're going to get. So there they are there. So we're going to knock off. This is all about developing a shared understanding about terminology. Some of you are probably in the right space. Some of you have experienced it for a while. But it's all trying to get us on the same page, if that makes sense, around it. Because we've all got pre-existing experiences that we tend to shape how we think and what we do. And at least for this workshop, just trying to get you to understand some of the terminology that's rolling through. So we're going to roll through in terms of disaster risks. Then we'll look at these strategic risks, so you can classify risks. That's the PEESTOLM. Then we'll have a look at what it looks like to reduce risk. What makes good preparedness? How do you know? So again, this is me saying you need a structured, systematic approach. This can be done in a very structured way. Monitoring and review and communications and continuing engagement. If there are managers in the room that have done project management, that's what it looks like, all right? So I throw in the odd picture so it's at least a little bit interesting. If anyone's ever heard of a pyrocumulonimbus, so that's a smoke-driven fire that causes storms and lightning. That one's pushing to about 25,000 feet, which is severe. Next slide. Okay, so hazard, Steve introduced this, but the key thing is hazard only has potential harm, all right? It's not a disaster in its own right, and when it impacts, it's going to impact those four environments, all right? One or more of them, chances are all four of them, all right? Pretty important to pick that up in terms of trying to roll through. Again, most of you would know they're either natural or anthropogenic or human. Familiar? Yes, stick up your hand. Natural. All right, geological are obvious, aren't they? Earthquakes, volcanoes, all right, cyclones, typhoons, weather-driven events, whereas the human-driven ones can be deliberately lit fires, but also chemical, geological, as they relate to mining. And something I learned a long way back is Indonesia is a supermarket of disasters. Pretty much they have everything, all right? Hence the all hazards approach. Hazards defined by where they are, how big they are, how frequently they are, all right? And what's the chances of them occurring? So do you think history tells you that? Typically it does, but what we know with climate change is that the intensity and frequency is increasing exponentially. All right, it's really significant. Away you go, next one. All right, so you're just reinforcing what I've said there. You can see cyclone, tornado, drought, lightning strike. The claim a lot of Western world countries is a lot of their fires are lightning strike fires. Most of them are actually by humans. So, and you can see in there biological gets a run as well. Roll it through. Take a breath. So, disaster. What did you hear from Steve? You'll hear it from me many times over. All right. The key thing is it's an inability of the community to cope, and the community is not just the people. It's the built infrastructure, all right? It's the natural environment, it's the economic environment, all right? But what makes the disaster is the exposure to a hazard, but also the vulnerability. So if you've got a resilient community, the vulnerability is lower, isn't it? Can you see that? So if they develop some resilience, so it's quite important. But the key thing about a disaster is society is, as you know it, is completely disrupted. All right? Doesn't matter what the emergency responders do, there will be no success. You can't rely on the normal emergency response systems to get you out of jail. And so that is why a community has to be able to cope itself. That's why you've got to get ready to be able to cope in terms of picking it up. So it's quite important. And almost certainly with a disaster, recovery will take forever. And so the key thing is the better you can mitigate the hazard impact, the recovery will be much shorter. So 4 environments listed there, echo of message, trying to roll it on. Next one. So when I see emergency, the first thing I remember is, and I didn't actually know it till about 5 years ago, but the United Nations dropped the terminology emergency almost 20 years ago. Who would have thought? Eh? So it's not in the terminology bank, even though in most Australian states, and if you go to particularly Western world countries, the term emergency is still there. And it's probably acceptable for when emergency services and others successfully do their job. But particularly with climate-driven emergencies, they're turning into disasters. All right, so after an emergency, for the most part, a community will bounce back. They'll be relatively intact, if I can put it that way. I've just popped in the little blue box there, another piece of terminology that's used called an incident. All right, so an incident typically might be a house fire, might be a shopping centre collapse. It's quite localised. Does that sound familiar to you? Work? Okay, roll over the last one for definition. Crisis. So again, tending to roll terminology together. People often don't separate crisis from emergency or disaster. But a crisis typically is within an organisation. IT crisis is common, food poisoning events in a society. So it's generally dealt with by normal systems. Ring any bells? So can you start to see they're actually different? So they're quite different in terms of how you might deal with them in terms of trying to pick them up. So roll over. Anyone having a think about whether you've had a crisis, an emergency or a disaster? Or what can you see looming? So this is one slide that just summarises everything we've had. Key thing in the box in the bottom there is what a community is. So this is asking you to think about whether your sanctuary or your facility is a community in its own right, or whether it has shared, if you like, relationships, dependencies with the community around you. You know, so do staff come from that community? Do you get resources from that community? So they've got the same risks that you've got. So if you go down or they go down, you're all going down together. So I'm asking you to think about where your community might start and finish. All right, it's a pretty important concept to have. Got all the hazards there, hit the go button, we're going to get an impact. All right, so key thing about the impact is, I'd like you to think about imminent versus actual. All right, how many of you have got a warning app or something on your phone for where you live? Anyone? So Indonesia has 3 different warning advices they issue on their phones, interestingly, for different types of hazard impact. One great success of Sendai 2015 is almost all countries now have warning systems. And the beauty of warning system is you can take action before the impact occurs. Does that make sense? So move out of harm's way. Can you move things? All right, a really nice paper a bit further north of here, a very small endangered group of animals, and a lot of research was done about in a typhoon hits, they would have been wiped out, but their plan is to move those animals before the typhoon hits. That's pretty clever, isn't it? All right, a couple of zoos in the US did it when they had fires as well. They'd practiced it. They'd walk their animals to where they were going to go so they weren't going to be affected by the smoke or the fire. Pretty clever, all right? So you don't need to wait for the impact. You get an impact, there should be one more arrow on there, I think, if it comes up for an emergency. Yes, no, there it is. So the one at the top, community is completely shot, can't cope. The one at the bottom, community broadly copes, but it'll take a little while to recover. Next. So what kind of brings this all together? So the trusty Venn diagram, you've got that risk in the middle, and you can start to see vulnerability, hazard and exposure. So the example I used to use early days when I was talking to Steve was mid-ocean ridge, volcanic eruption in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Unless you happen to live there, it's not a disaster, is it? But there's still a hazard there, but it's no threat. There's no exposure, there's no vulnerability. So you need to understand the exposure to the hazard or hazards. Steve talked about an all hazards approach. The good news for you on Wednesday is we're going to ask you to work on one hazard at a time, not multi-hazards. And what you'll gradually find is that the treatments for a high risk hazard is pretty much the same for any other that follows through. And to demonstrate very simply, disaster impacts in a lot of parts of the world, and I mean disaster, not emergency, the first real need afterwards is clean drinking water. Do you think that's different for an earthquake or a flood or a fire? It's not. So can you start to see the treatment can be the same, all right? So you need to understand what the vulnerability of the community is, and part of that understanding is how those 4 environments can stand up. So Steve, that paper that Steve talked about where 8% of the orangutans went down last year, the stat that blew me away in that paper was how many landslides did they have during that cyclone event? 8,000. That kind of pushes your likelihood up a bit, doesn't it? That's pretty high. I had trouble getting my head around it. So, question there about whether you're dealing with multiple hazards or a single hazard, but terminology that I use is most likely worst case scenario. So choose a hazard that's most likely to bite you badly. Does that ring true? People understand that? And for a lot of you that don't have the lived experience, you might know what that is at the moment. You know, but typically if you particularly start talking to elders and the like in communities, they can often tell you what it was like last time and then magnify it with climate change. Hit the button. So risk reduction, this is where the hard work starts. How do you build this resilience across environments? So the built environment is often the obvious one. You know, can you build a structure that's going to The obvious one in this part of the world is earthquake. So yes, you can build a structure that'll survive an earthquake. You know, they survived quite well. Argentina, you saw buildings that stood up, other buildings that didn't meet the standard fell down. Another one for the built and the social environment is if people live on a floodplain, move it. So after the 2011 floods in southeast Queensland that pretty much drowned a whole village of 300 people, the government built a whole new suburbia on top of a hill and said, we'll give you the land and the infrastructure, you just have to put your house there. No more flooding. All right, so they're what you might look as extreme options, but that's what you've got to start to look at long term of how to do these. The other thing is immediately you'll come up with existing risks. So what are the current risks? And what we find sometimes is when people address the current risk, they generate a new risk. All right, so then you have to rethink that. And if you apply a treatment to a risk, you'll finish up with a residual risk. Is that residual risk acceptable? Is it all you've done is kind of shift the barometer a little bit? Is it still in the red? Or can you pull it back even further? What do you need to keep doing? Again, echoing this community can't cope, you've got to remember the key thing you've got to do is get a community that will survive post-impact. All right? And again, if it's about people, move people out of harm's way. And we'll talk about it a little bit as it goes on. Recovery costs, if you spend 1 unit, $1, this is UN figures, in mitigation, it saves you $8 in recovery. That's a pretty big return on investment, isn't it? The challenge is, I expect for a lot of you, is how do you get that $1 in the first place? How do you mount that argument? And I think that there are a number of options there. At the moment, you've got a lot of non-government organisations, global ones, that come in to save the day in response phase. I think they've got a role to actually start doing resources back in the mitigation phase so that they're not just saving the day. Make sense? Does that kind of see where I'm coming from? All right. And there's a nice little spider web in the bottom there. Can't remember a lady, but a professor from the University of Melbourne about 20 years ago gave me this one I thought was a great analogy for a community was a spider web. Now your job as disaster management people is to keep that spider web intact. The more bits of the web you break, the more bits you have to put back. Pretty neat, I reckon. All right, so just think about it. Not all spider webs are that nice shape. Beautiful. So risks. We've all done the whole risk assessment thing in different ways, shapes or forms. We know it's kind of likelihood consequence, but as Steve mentioned, my experience is people focus on likelihood and not on consequence. Do you see where I'm coming from? Simple example in real life world when I used to train people in this. Travel down the road in our part of the world these days, if you go through a red light camera, you're likely to get a picture and a bill in the mail. All right, so it'll photograph you and it'll do the same for a phone. And when I used to run the training, I used to say to people, would you go through that intersection if it didn't have a red light camera on it? And they'd say, yes, I'm not going to get a bill in the mail. Except a third of accidents at intersections with traffic lights on them, either fatal or serious injury. That sounds like a pretty good reason not to go through a red light, doesn't it? Can you see where I'm coming from? So you've got to think about the consequence, not just about likelihood. Okay, so we've mentioned the kind of multiple hazard impact and most likely worst case scenario. So what happens, terminology compounding, cascading, and some literature talks about primary and secondary risks. So what this is about is that sometimes one risk, so the risk of the bridge in town being flooded, all right, that's the risk. But what's the compounding effects of that bridge going underwater? Does that mean you get no clean drinking water? Does it mean you get no pharmaceuticals for your animals? Can you see where I'm coming from? and how long is that bridge going to be out? How long can you survive for? So typically, the disaster management people expect a community to survive minimum of 3 days before they might get help, but now that's been pushed out to 14 days. Okay? So risk there, and where does the risk come from? Next slide provides a bit of the answer. This is where we start to do real work. So this is an acronym. I cannot for the life of you tell me where it was first developed, and it's often the letters are in different ways and different words. But basically, every one of these is a source of risk. Now, when you look at political, most of you think of elected officials, but in fact, it can be people that are very senior in private organisations that can have influence over what might happen. So way back in the dark ages, when I had to kill a couple of million chickens, I found the best solution to get rid of them was to put them into a power station. They burnt in 0.02 of a second. But what stopped me was the chief executive officer of the power station. The government couldn't even change his mind. So you can have influence. Economic, and these are at all levels. And one of the references you'll get is I wrote a chapter in State of the Apes around disasters and ape conservation. And when I started writing it, there was no COVID, but when I got into COVID and I was writing through COVID, 2 countries that have significant gorilla tourism in the world, a really high proportion of their GDP comes from gorilla tourism. What do you think they did when COVID came along? They shut down gorilla tourism. Were there any ripple effects from that? Significant. At village level, no income coming in, people going back to bush hunting, all right, no food source because there's no economy. The ranges that were paid for gorilla conservation, no funding for them. A lot of them were actually taken off under COVID. And one of those 2 countries was amongst the first in the world to lift its COVID restrictions. Why? So they could get gorilla tourism back on the map. That's an economic impact. Significant, isn't it? All right, but I suspect most of you in the room wouldn't have seen that coming, would you? All right, so really, and if you wanted to read it in detail, it's in that chapter and it's all well referenced. And interesting, in the technical world at the time, in the literature, there were people for and against shutting down gorilla tourism. And people arguing exactly what would happen if you did, which is what did happen, and others saying no, we had to do it to protect the gorillas. Interestingly, published in the middle of that, there was a paper for research that was done over years before COVID to show the normal restrictions that were put in place around distance and masks and things to protect the gorillas. What that paper said was that better than 80% of the time those restrictions were not being applied as part of the tourism event anyway. All right, so interesting. Environmental, I don't need to talk about environmental impacts to you, but increasingly around the world, it's understood that the environment, so last year the floods that you had were linked to a lot of deforestation. The reverse in Australia is people are now being paid to put trees back on farms to slow the water moving through the catchments. All right, and that reminds me that IUCN actually has something called nature-based solutions disaster risk mitigation. All right, and the thing is that everything that's in there is kind of familiar to me. So in my fire world, we have things called asset protection zones. So it's a 100 or 300 metre wide zone right around an asset. So when a fire comes, it won't directly impact the asset. Well, that's now seen as a nature-based solution, all right? But it's been there for 30 odd years. Social impacts, this is where people die, all right? You lose expertise in a community. What happens when you lose the only doctor? All right, can be quite significant. Technical risks, so these are the ones that are related to the hazard. All right, biosecurity is most familiar to you as a technical risk, but all these hazards have technical risks. Operational risks will be the ones that you most frequently identify. These are the things where you need to be able to do something, and you'll say, I haven't got enough people, I haven't got enough resource. So operational risks for my world are having the right resource in the right place at the right time, all right, in terms of picking it up. Legal risks. Do any of you think you might have a legal risk? It's quite interesting when you look around the world where people think they can do things and they actually find out they don't actually have the legal authority to do what they thought they were going to be able to do. Can you move animals in harm's way? And I know 2 well-published examples where they found out they didn't have the legal authority to do what they wanted to do. They had to change the law. And media and comms, this was added in the last 10 years. So it's all about trying to get trusted information to communities that they can rely on. But the reverse applies now where social media and other media is just full of information that's not fact. So it's full of risks. We'll bump into this again, so don't get too fussed about it. You can push the next button. So I'm going to roll through these pretty quickly because we're going to look at them on Wednesday. So what are your risk treatment options? And this is, again, just trying to remind you that this can be done systematically. Can you avoid the risk? Can you completely get away from it? Likelihood is the most common way of reducing risk, all right? Reducing consequences is very hard. So as I put it when I used to do a lot of training, dead is dead. And it's very hard to bring back that consequence to where people survive. So typically you're reducing the likelihood, but you can reduce both likelihood and consequence. Transfer risk in the Western world, most common example, insure the property. So it's not your risk, it's someone else. Does that make sense? So you can share the risk with someone else, pick it up, try and find someone that wants to pick it up. And there are going to be circumstances where it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to have to live with a risk. And that's where preparedness might get you out of jail. All right? But that's where you might just want to move people out of harm's way. Go. Every time I see that quarantine area, I think, yeah, that's really effective. So if you actually look at the quarantine sign, it's a sign. And it falls under administration on that table. That is the lowest level of risk mitigation. Is that sign going to stop anyone going in? Nope. But if you've built a really big wall, which is isolation, people couldn't get in. Can you start to see? So I'm just trying to push you up the top. So elimination is your preferred option, and if you shift from off a floodplain to on a hill, that's eliminating the risk. Now that's not easy. Can you live on a houseboat? So when it floods, your boat just goes up and down? That's substitution. You start to see. So in your built infrastructure, what's one of the most common things that you're going to lose in a disaster? Electricity supply. Someone might say Wi-Fi or comms these days. But how many different ways are there of ensuring you've got a reliable supply of electricity? All right, I live in suburbia and I'm really lucky. None of my suburb has power lines above the ground. All right, so we're never likely to use it, but I still have a 10 kilowatt battery on my house. All right, and more than enough to run my house for days. My son lives in rural North Coast and he's just put a battery on his house so he can run the fridge, all the electronic devices for 5 days, even if there's no sun. Substitution. Can you start to see? If you've got a nice little water course, put a water wheel on it to charge the battery. You don't need flash technologies to do it. Engineering control. So this one's pretty tricky. So engineering control is no human intervention, nothing at all. It does the job of its own account. So an earthquake, a building that survives an earthquake has got engineering built into it. That's the engineering control. Can you see that? All of you that drive modern cars that have anti-skid brakes, that's an engineering control. So they're not that common, but they're pretty hard to find. And you can see at the bottom, All of you, I'm sure, have got procedures, policies, training, but ultimately it's a pretty low-level control. And what I find is when you get into responses, often they kind of are forgotten. Go. So these are the big steps, and now you can see preparedness crop up there. So prevention is this push. It's this risk mitigation. So can you avoid the risk? Can you look for ways of completely stepping outside the risk? You know, so you might have a relatively low-level potential risk of trees falling across your space, all right, onto your cages or into your sanctuaries or into those places. So pretty, in disaster terms, it's not a disaster, it's close to a crisis. But what we're finding in Australia is insurance companies are now saying to people that have got trees around their house, we won't insure your property unless you remove the trees. Can you see that's prevention on their part as well as the householder, so you can shift it. Preparedness, this is where you'll do a lot of your work and you're more comfortable doing it. So what are those measures that you're going to do that are going to make your response just look oh so beautiful? All right, response. So structured, systematic, stands up, mentions incident control systems. So I know there are some people in the room that are familiar with incident management teams. Incident control, there's another 3 days of training just in that alone. All right, and Indonesia has its own version of that. Most countries do. So you just piggyback on the back of that in terms of trying to pick it up. And you'll notice the word collaborative there. Much better if you can build relationships before the event, because then you'll be trusted. All right, and if everyone shares in the risks, they'll contribute to it. Recovery's down there, so that's how you're going to put it back. Interesting, the UN has picked up on the term rebuild back better or build back better. I think I've probably heard that terminology for 30 years. So don't just build it back the way it was, you know, do a better job. Put it somewhere else if you're going to have to do it. I've got relief there. Surprising? So often you'll see the term relief and recovery. So relief is just that short term, all right, we're going to get water to you, we're going to get some food to you. It's just those short term things to get you through until the main, if you like, risk to the community has passed in terms of rolling along. And that house in 30 years has had water through it, all right, 13 times, and the house is only 40 years old. Why would you build there? Do you see my point? And as a person that pays insurance, I'm contributing to his insurance because he can't afford the risk. Next. So just a little bit more detail around the treatment. So what are the... So you remember, you've got to be exposed to the hazard. So can you change the exposure to the hazard? Can you move away, move around from, change? Obviously, if you're in an earthquake zone, you can't change that, but you can think about how you might. So it's that vulnerability exposures, all right? It talks about avoid the high risk zones. So it's kind of pretty clear. Most countries now have flood mapping. Anyone see your flood mapping for your footprint? All right, digitally, you can just watch your house disappear underwater. All right, and I kind of looked at Steve then, because way back in 2001, when I was in the UK for foot and mouth disease, the new agency in 2001 predicted that the UK would be exposed to floods like the country had never seen. That's pretty impressive. They were ahead of climate change debate, and that's actually what's happened. All right, and they're now moving to the debate of just not rebuilding where people were. Engineering solutions we've talked about. Levees are typically a way of fixing flood-prone area, but Lismore in New South Wales, when it flooded in 2022, they'd only finished the new levee 2 years before, supposedly for a 1 in 100 year flood. Well, the flood in 2022 went 6 metres over that levee. And the levee was 14 metres high. All right, you've got to get it right. Warning systems I've talked about. I encourage you, wherever you are, to get familiar with your warning system. But what's your warning system for your own community? A lot of communities still have a bell, you know, or something like that, a siren. Someone goes and winds the siren up, and everyone around, they know what that means, you know, that something's on, something's going down. So it's pretty important. Technical solutions, people often don't think about technical solutions, but vaccination is an example of a technical solution. So you can find technical solutions. All right, and I mentioned the investment in prevention earlier. Nice little quote there from a vet that I worked with for 25 years. We were debriefing the equine influenza outbreak, and we were trying to get people to understand that you need to be structured and systematic, and he stood up at the back of the room trying to remind people of this and said that effort and commitment don't equal excellence. So in a response, you will all work as hard as you can, but if it's not structured and systematic, you won't get the results that you deserve. Does that make sense? Can you relate to that? So you're still going to have to work bloody hard, but just kind of get it right. Picture at the bottom there was a levee that was built as the water was rising, literally building it. The community was building it, and in the end it didn't hold. Water went in, and in the end the levee held the water inside the levee after it had gone down in the river. Reverse engineering. Preparedness is the footprint and mostly what emergency management agencies do. This is their core business. All right, and a few quotes over the years that I build up with, I kind of like. Every time we get into preparedness, people tell me they want to do a contingency plan, and I kind of look at them and smile and think, yeah, well, that's kind of nice. And that's where we were 30 years ago, 35 years ago, was contingency plans. And you've got to exercise the plan, but the reality is that it won't address most of your risks. All right? You need a plan, but it needs to be good. Needs to be built up in terms of trying to put it in. So this top statement that it's a complex problem, and if you're not prepared for it, it'll find holes, it'll find little weaknesses in a response that you didn't consider, whereas if you take risk-based approach, you should be able to pick them up. Go. So this preparedness, you can see there, it's about understanding what the risks are associated. So that not just all of them, all the hazards, but the ones that are really going to be important. The warning system, make sure you've got some way of telling the community what's going on. Interestingly, way back when I was looking at literature following the tsunami in 2001 in Indonesia, there are a number of reports of elephants, but also buffaloes, that were moving to high ground before the tsunami arrived. So there was an interesting warning system, all right, in terms of picking it up. So not something that we're likely to have in Western world countries, but it's there. There's coordination. So how do you get all the players on the same page so that they're not falling over each other? Who's doing what? Make sure they're doing it together. You need systems of management. People understand what I mean by that. So people normally think about technology as a system of management. Sometimes it's an Excel spreadsheet. But a system management is more than that. So you've got to collect the information, you've got to collate it, all right? You've then got to process it, all right? Make sense of it, turn it into intelligence so you can use it. So system management covers all of that. And you need management for resourcing. You've got to track your resource, where things are going, what they're doing, how much you've got in reserve. If you're spending money, you need a good financial management system. So if a response says to me they've got a good system of management, I can find about 30, but typically 5 systems of management are going to be what you need in terms of trying to pick them up. All right, documentation, it's at the bottom for a reason. You will have a whole range of documentation. All right, you will have a contingency plan, you will have procedures, you will have policies, you will have legislation. And capacity and capability is usually the most common reason that responses struggle So this is about right resource in the right place at the right time, and that usually means surge capacity. So where do you get your reserves from? Where do they come from? Not just the people, but all those things that you're going to need to survive that kind of 3, 10, 14 days. I noticed when I had a look back in June, there were still people living in blue tents who'd lost their houses back in December. 6 months on. That's a disaster, all right? And where do you find houses for 100,000 people? So resourcing, in all my experience, has always been the biggest challenge. You'll see I mentioned stockpiling. So long before COVID and back when we had H5N1 in the early 2000s, travelling around the world, I had stockpiles of 10,000 pairs of disposable overalls, 100,000 masks, because we were likely to need them to deal with an outbreak in a poultry farm or multiple poultry farms. All right, but then you have to think about use by dates, because things like masks have use by dates on them. Go. So these are the key 5 elements of preparedness. Governance, I said we'd come back to it. Now, governance isn't just about those that are going to manage the response. This is about governance for preparedness. This is the board of management to set things up. The governance board is not necessarily the people that are doing things. They're oversighting it, making sure it's transparent. Systems management, we briefly talked about. You can see there's a whole range there. Safety, for me, is number 1. I'm pleased to say in my many decades, I've never had a fatality in a whole range of disasters. So we want all your people to come home, and you'll have to work quite hard on that. The documentation we've talked about. I would encourage a lot of you these days, if you think you've got a procedure printed on paper, is it better in what other form these days? Can't you make a video? A lot of things that you write down are now much better done with a short video, and you're more likely to get it shared these days as well. So the more videos, I just think it's a great, one of the first procedures I ever wrote was entry and exit to an infected premise. And it was pages long. And then we did a PowerPoint, and then we did a video. The video was 90 seconds. People got it, and you could send it far and wide. It makes sense? And we haven't bumped into exercises and simulations yet. So this is where you get to practice, rehearse, show you can do it, find out where the gaps are. Another reason to engage with more people. And we'll have a whole session on that later in the workshop about developing exercises and simulations. The bottom diagram shows you that not only does the individual need to be ready, so are you ready? As I put it, are you mission ready? But then all the way across, is your team ready? Is the multi-team ready? Are they all going to be able to work together? Are they all on the same hymn sheet? Really quite important to do that. So you've got to push it right across. Next one should be the WHO. Yep. So interestingly, Ebola Mark 1, have a look and see whether they've learnt the lessons. Really well documented. And if you have a look, the same 5 elements of preparedness are in there, just with different words. Allocated funding, so this time they've been saying they didn't have enough funds to start with. Where are their systems? So they had no reporting systems way back then. Timely information was a massive problem, and we still had a lot of computers in 2013. Governance has been highlighted all around the world as a key issue for these kind of things in preparedness, notice, not response. And one of the WHO mistakes was they imported a whole lot of experts to deal with the Ebola outbreak, and those experts didn't come with a cultural understanding. They know community engagement. There are 3 authors that wrote massive numbers of papers around the lack of understanding of this local capacity and capability. Build it up locally. Don't bring it in from somewhere else. And community engagement for Ebola was, that time around, was massive. I'm looking around to see how many people in the room might have been very young and probably didn't remember it. But one of the key issues was that the international people were telling communities how they had to bury their dead that had died of Ebola. And the communities are going, no, that's not how we do it. So there was no engagement, no mixing with the community to understand the cultural needs of what was going on. Very, very important to get your head around. Go. All right, monitoring and review. So in old language, plan, delegate, check. So how is all this work going? You need to see whether what you think you're doing, so you've got to monitor it along the way, but then you've got to check to see whether you are addressing the risks you thought you were addressing. You know, so you've got this continuous timeline of trying to improve it, and don't just think that when you've finished, yeah, I've done it. You need to actually, in a roundabout way, test it, and you could test it in an exercise, but get with the community and find out whether the measures that you think you're going to treat are going to work, all right, in terms of trying to pick that up. And a little bit of terminology at the bottom there. So most of you would talk about lessons learned. Now, a lesson is only when it's first identified, it's a lesson identified. It's not learnt until it's been embedded going forward. All right, does that make sense? So you might identify it, but until you work out how you're going to fix it and it's fixed, it becomes a lesson learnt. So you'll need to educate people around you. Push the button. And already today, all three of us have talked about the importance of communication, but I just really want to emphasise the importance of community engagement. You need to work out every way you can to engage with those that share the risk, those that have a shared ability to address it. You do that as part of your normal day for a whole lot of different reasons, but you need to build this shared responsibility, all right, in terms of ownership. They mightn't bring much to the party, but you need them to support you going forward. And I'm upfront to tell you it's about the hardest thing you will have to do. You have to invest a lot of time and effort, and often seems unrewarding, but it becomes rewarding at the end of the day. Push the button. See, how's that? So this is an example of, at the end of every presentation, there are all these references, and they've got the links in there as well, in terms of trying to pick them up. All right, and that's me. Is that good for you?
Okay. Thank you, Kevin, for the more detailed and clear explanation relating with the disaster risk reduction. So we still have a couple minutes. So, so we let only one question. So please raise hand if somebody want to ask a question.
It's all right, I'm not going anywhere, I'm going to be around, and usually what you might find is at meal breaks or something, I try and sit down with people that I haven't spoken to before, and that often gives them an opportunity to ask something that they mightn't have otherwise in a bigger audience. So that's same deal, that's community engagement. Often people sit at the back of the room and you have to work out who they are and go and stand next to them and ask them how they're going. Is it all right? And once you start having a chat about something that's important to them, you usually find out they have got a question.
Yes. Okay, if nobody, so anywhere, is Kevin will not going anywhere, so he will be around. So once you have a question for him, just straight ask to him. So now we will move to the next session, and I'll pass the microphone to Wendy.
Thank you, Dr. Ida. Maybe I will do it here. Okay, to make people for the next presenter more, yeah. We will have, the next one is we will hear the story from the field. This year, actually, we are quite surprised and really appreciate that more than 25 abstract was sent to us, maybe like around 30 abstract. Give applause. It's not only story from the field, but also about the case study for day 2 and also day 4. But before go to the presenter, I know the first presenter will be like, okay, it's my turn. I want to make a little bit move your body first before hear the next presenter. Maybe it's not the chicken dance by any, no, not today.